It started with a simple cold, a headache, and everyday relief turned into an unspeakable horror. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman took 2 Tylenol capsules for a mild illness and never woke up. Hours later, in another Chicago suburb, 27-year-old Adam Janus collapsed suddenly. His grieving family gathered to mourn him, only for 2 of them to take the same pills and meet the same fate. Something unthinkable was happening, and the worst part? No one knew who would be next. Over just 3 days, 7 people were dead. Investigators soon uncovered a chilling truth. Someone had laced extra-strength Tylenol capsules with lethal doses of cyanide. But why? Who would commit such a horrifying crime? More than 40 years later, the mystery of the Tylenol murders remains unsolved. Was it a calculated act of domestic terrorism, a random psychopath, or something even more sinister? Join us as we unravel one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in American history, the Tylenol murders. But before we dive in, some of the details in this story are extremely disturbing and may not be suitable for all audiences, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. As always, remember to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on post notifications to stay up to date with the channel. All right, let's dive into the video. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up in a Chicago suburb on September 29, 1982, complaining to her parents that she was getting a cold. They gave her 2 extra-strong Tylenol acetaminophen capsules, and soon after they discovered Mary on the bathroom floor. They took her to the hospital, where she passed away shortly after. Doctors suspected she may have had a stroke, but that is uncommon in someone so young. On the same day, paramedics were called to the home of 27-year-old postal worker Adam Janus in another Chicago suburb. When they arrived, Adam was unresponsive, so they rushed him to the hospital, but he passed away shortly after from what was believed to be a heart attack. That evening, Adam's family gathered at his house to arrange for his early burial. Adam's sister-in-law, Teresa, who was 19 years old, and her husband, Stanley, who was 25, complained of a headache. Stanley and his wife each took a few extra-strength Tylenol tablets Stanley found on his brother's counter. A little while later, both of them collapsed, and paramedics were called to Adam Janus's house again. Stanley died that night, and his wife, Teresa, died 2 days later. The deaths of 3 young people from the same family at the same place was very unsettling. Authorities evacuated the remainder of the family, assuming there might have been a hazardous gas leak or something. When someone passes away suddenly, forensic death investigators frequently inspect the scene and speak with witnesses, family members, or co-workers to help pathologists determine the cause and manner of death. They suspected poisoning and collected blood samples from all 3 of them for toxicology. When these death investigations in the Chicago region revealed that Mary Kellerman and all 3 of the Janus family members had taken extra-strength Tylenol before their deaths, these investigators attempted to establish connections between the events, materials, and circumstances surrounding the death.
It was the beginning of a nightmare for Chicago, a nightmare that is still not over for some. 7 people were dead because someone had laced capsules of extra-strength Tylenol with cyanide. And there was fear more people, more innocent people, would die.
Police returning quickly to the scene, forensic chemistry revealed that several of the remaining acetaminophen tablets were contaminated with extremely high quantities of potassium cyanide, thousands of times the fatal dosage. 3 other women in the Chicago region had already taken Tylenol and died by the time Johnson & Johnson, the company that makes the medication, was promptly notified and issued a comprehensive product recall of 31 million bottles. When investigators compared the locations of the victims' homes, they concluded that it was highly unlikely that the 27-year-old Mary Reiner, who had just given birth days earlier, the 35-year-old Paula Prince, a flight attendant, and the 31-year-old Mary McFarland, who collapsed in her office at the phone company, had all bought the medication from the same store. They used the lot numbers on the bottles to determine whether the bottles had come from the same manufacturing plant. But they hadn't, so Johnson was most likely not the source, either by accident or sabotage. However, it was crucial to spread the word. Chicago police cars used loudspeakers to warn people not to take Tylenol, and Johnson offered a $100,000 reward for information that led to the capture of those involved. Investigators took the product off store shelves nationwide for forensic testing, but only 8 adulterated packages were eventually found in this horrific death lottery. It's uncertain how many poison packages customers might have thrown away after discovering about the recall. Of these 8 tainted packages, 5 were involved in the deaths. 2 others were returned to stores and 1 was discovered on a store shelf. The 8 bottles of tainted medication came from 7 different locations, according to investigators using a combination of store receipts and surveillance footage. At the time, store surveillance equipment was not nearly as common as it is now, and no usable fingerprints were found on any of the packaging or contents. Additionally, each of the 8 bottles contained 3 to 10 contaminated capsules. Investigators came to the conclusion that someone was stealing or purchasing extra-strength Tylenol bottles from retailers, opening the gel caps, adding cyanide, and then putting the products back on store shelves for the innocent victims to buy. You can only imagine the speed at which the Illinois Department of Health and forensic experts had to come together for this significant case of product tampering. They created a quick test that used a little piece of paper that had been chemically altered and could be put into a bottle. If there was cyanide present, the strip would turn blue. This is referred to as field tests, or occasionally screening tests. They make quick, presumptive identification possible. Substances that test positive are then put through what are known as confirmatory tests, which use advanced lab equipment and more complex chemical analysis. The question of who might have obtained potassium cyanide was one that detectives investigated. Because of its use in mining and some industrial settings, investigators looked for any leads in those areas. They also took into account anybody who might have been unhappy with Johnson & Johnson and wished to harm the company's reputation as a form of retaliation. Suspects were identified by the FBI and various Chicago police departments, and around 400 people were interviewed. A do-it-yourself chemist named Roger Arnold was the first big suspect. He was employed at one of the business's loading docks and had a tenuous link to another store where contaminated capsules were discovered. Since Arnold's co-worker was the father of Tylenol victim Mary Rayner, authorities initially questioned whether Arnold harbored resentment toward Mary's father and perhaps exploited the other murders to try to hide his one true target. Arnold suffered a mental collapse as a result of the media attention, but investigators were unable to link him to the crimes. Arnold chose to shoot the man he thought had led police toward him because he knew him from a local tavern. But one evening outside the bar, Arnold shot another man, whom he thought was his intended victim. The Tylenol murders claimed the life of that defenseless man. After serving 15 years of a 30-year sentence for second-degree murder, Arnold was granted release. He passed away in 2008.
Authorities believe Lewis wrote an extortion note to the manufacturers of Tylenol demanding $1 million be sent to an account at the Continental Illinois Bank. Investigators shown here at Task Force headquarters in Des Plaines apparently still have no tangible evidence linking Lewis to the Tylenol cyanide murders.
In any case, the Tylenol investigation swiftly shifted to a more promising suspect in 1982, while Arnold was being exonerated. An anonymous letter with a New York postmark was delivered to Johnson & Johnson. Although it didn't explicitly acknowledge being written by the murderer, the handwritten note detailed how easy and flawless the poisoning had gone. According to the writer, the task was finished in less than 10 minutes for each bottle and didn't even cost $50. The letter called the entire operation a beauty because the bitter poison was contained within the capsules, rendering it tasteless. Furthermore, cyanide functioned so fast and required such a small amount to be lethal that in practice, there was nothing that could be done to save the victims. If Johnson & Johnson executives wanted the deaths and negative publicity to cease, They were told in the letter to put $1 million into a specified account at the Continental Illinois Bank in Chicago. Was this letter really from the Tylenol killer? Or was it a prank? Could it have been from an unrelated extortionist trying to capitalize on the poisonings? The letter mentioned a bank account that had once belonged to Frederick Miller McCahey, but was now closed. He had operated a recently bankrupt travel agency in Chicago and was one of the heirs to the Miller Brewing Company. However, why would a man include his bank account number in such a letter of extortion? Was there someone attempting to frame him? Investigators were unaware at the time that Frederick's bookkeeper, Leanne Lewis, and her husband, James Lewis, were upset with him. In the summer of 1982, months before the Tylenol poisonings, they had even attempted to sue Frederick for being stiffed on a lousy salary. It had been bounced by the travel agency.
The investigation has produced two major characters. James Lewis is charged with writing an extortion letter demanding $1 million to stop the killing. A nationwide search finally netted Lewis and his wife in New York. His trial is next month. Authorities don't believe he is a prime suspect in the murders.
We must now delve a little deeper into the couple's lives to fully understand this situation. James Lewis was diagnosed with schizophrenia and had a very challenging childhood, despite being in his mid-30s in 1982. He was known to have some major issues at home, despite having outstanding marks and being quite busy at school. James Lewis allegedly beat up her husband and chased his adoptive mother around with an axe in his late adolescence, before attempting suicide by overdosing on the over-the-counter painkiller Anacin. Since this was during the Vietnam War, he later claimed that the attacks and suicide attempts were merely a ruse to avoid the draft. He healed at a mental health facility. He later met and married Leanne while he was a student at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, and the couple soon had a child with Down syndrome. In order to have their daughter with them at work every day, the couple started their own accounting and tax firm in Kansas City to meet their child's demands. The young child was said to sit in the storefront window and wave to passers-by. When Raymond West, an older guy, noticed the child one day, he came into the store and made friends with the family. Living in the Kansas City neighborhood where the Lewises had their company, West was a retired bachelor. He soon became a tax customer and became even closer to the couple after their 5-year-old daughter passed away after heart surgery. In the summer of 1978, some 3.5 years later, Raymond West stopped by the neighborhood florist for his regular Sunday visit. He claimed that he didn't feel well, among other things that were mentioned. He was last seen alive at that point. In this entire Tylenol tragedy, Raymond West's death is a mystery in and of itself. But to sum it up, 3 weeks later, in the summer of Kansas City, his dismembered and decaying body was discovered in his house. Before we continue on, if you are enjoying the video so far, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And if you don't like it, let me know down in the comments. Your support truly means everything. All right, back to the video.
This was the scene 4 years ago in Kansas City when police found the dismembered body of 72-year-old Raymond West, a friend of James Lewis. Lewis was indicted for the murder of West, but the charge was later dropped because of technicalities. Now the case has been reopened. FBI lab tests found Lewis's fingerprints on a pulley used to hoist West's body.
Let's now examine how James Lewis relates to it. A worried buddy had repeatedly tried to get in touch with Raymond while he was AWOL. He proceeded to Raymond's residence and called the police, who agreed to investigate after he saw the man's unmade bed through an open window shade. Later, the same friend went back to Raymond's house, only to discover a message on the door with the same window shade closed. Raymond West was out of town for a few days, and anyone with questions should call James Lewis, according to the note, which was written on letterhead from James Lewis and Lewis Tax Firm. Because of this, Raymond's friend became quite suspicious and convinced the police to do a quick search of the residence. They had to break the lock on the door to get in, but other than the fact that Raymond wasn't there, they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. Later, James Lewis arrived at Raymond's house to inquire about the situation, while this worried friend was installing a new lock. and the two men spoke for a time. However, his pal used the key to the new lock Raymond West had recently fitted after 3 weeks had gone by without hearing from him. When he opened the door, the overpowering stench of decay nearly tripped him. When the police came back, they found that the initial search had not gone quite as planned. In addition to the foul smell, they discovered a bloody lawn chair in the basement, a garbage bag filled with linen splashed with blood, and Raymond's glasses and hairpiece. But the scent did not seem to be coming from the basement. When the cops returned upstairs, they saw a bloody stain seeping through the bedroom ceiling's drywall. Using some sort of pulley system, the mutilated body parts of a man, possibly Raymond West, had been lifted into the attic. Regarding successful identification, this occurred before the development of forensic DNA testing. Raymond wore dentures manufactured by an out-of-business lab, and the remains were too decayed for fingerprints. In the end, a hair match between the last of Raymond's hair and a hair discovered in one of his hats proved the body belonged to him. Raymond West was still missing, of course. James Lewis became connected to the gruesome discovery of Raymond West's dismembered body through a $5,000 check drawn from Raymond's account, dated the same day Raymond was last seen alive. James claimed the money was a loan, but the bank didn't honor it since they couldn't reach Raymond for confirmation. When questioned by police about having any of Raymond's checks, James denied it. Although initially released, investigators soon discovered rope and trash bags matching those found at the crime scene in James's vehicle. They also found a pack of Raymond's blank checks and other documents. Despite his continued denial of involvement, James Lewis was charged with Raymond West's murder.
For the moment, he is one of 384 prisoners at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in the Loop. One day soon, he will likely be ordered to serve his prison term, which now totals 20 years, in some other federal prison.
James Lewis's trial for the 1978 murder of Raymond West was scheduled for fall of 1979, but the case collapsed due to legal errors. Crucially, all evidence gathered was deemed inadmissible because James wasn't informed of his Miranda rights. Furthermore, Raymond West's body had decomposed so severely that the cause of death couldn't be determined. As a result, even if James had been responsible for dismembering Raymond, the prosecution had little chance of proving it. Determined to find a way to prosecute James Lewis, authorities continued investigating his activities, including his tax business and ties to pill production equipment. In late 1981, investigators gathered enough evidence for a search warrant, but Lewis and his wife fled before the search could take place. They moved to Chicago under new identities, Robert and Nancy Richardson. In Chicago, James became involved with Frederick's failing travel business and played a role in organizing complaints against Frederick McKay. By the fall of 1982, just 25 days before the Tylenol poisonings began, James and Leanne Lewis had left Chicago for New York. Strangely, they reverted to their original identities upon arrival, continuing their shady operations. At the start of the Tylenol murder investigation, authorities had little to go on. The only clue they had was an extortion letter sent from New York, just days after the poisonings, which included Frederick's bank account number. Upon examining the envelope, forensic investigators discovered a postage meter stamp from Frederick's travel business, dated April 1982. It was later revealed that Leanne Lewis, who was still employed at Frederick McKay's company, had metered several blank envelopes. Unbeknownst to the police at the time, she had taken them home and used one of these envelopes to send the extortion letter from New York months later. Frederick McKay, a local celebrity, became a focus of the investigation. Police initially believed that the extortion letter was an attempt to embarrass Frederick rather than being connected to the Tylenol murders. However, they changed their view after learning of James Lewis's prior involvement in the dismemberment case of Raymond West in Kansas City and his criminal background in tax and business fraud. This revelation turned their attention to Lewis and his wife, who had disappeared after relocating to New York under the false identities of Robert and Nancy Richardson. As their aliases and faces became widely known in the media, the couple fled once again. Leanne resigned from her job in New York, and they stopped using the names Robert and Nancy Richardson. Those who had known them began to come forward, describing James Lewis as both cold and vengeful, while others saw him as a genius with the ability to speak on virtually any topic. When it emerged that James had also written a threatening letter to President Ronald Reagan, authorities began to connect him more closely to the Tylenol extortion letter. Fingerprint analysis soon confirmed that James's fingerprints were on the extortion letter, and handwriting analysis linked him to both the threatening letter to Frederick and the one sent to President Reagan. James Lewis, like other infamous criminals such as the Unabomber and BTK killer, started sending letters to the media. In one, he attempted to justify framing Frederick for the Tylenol murders, but he also denied any involvement in the killings, claiming that neither he nor his wife had returned to Chicago during the poisonings. Authorities tracked Leanne through a money order she received from her father. Meanwhile, a librarian in New York reported that James Lewis had recently asked for references from newspaper outlets, which led to his eventual arrest. Although the FBI had enough evidence to charge him with extortion, they were only able to prosecute Leanne for Social Security fraud, as she had used false identification at her previous job. Despite being urged to cooperate with the authorities, Leanne refused to turn herself in, and the investigation continued to unfold. James Lewis was found guilty of attempted extortion approximately a year after the Tylenol murders. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, which he will serve consecutively with the 10 years he was previously given for other offenses, such as tax fraud. James Lewis intended to cooperate with the authorities to try to solve the poisonings while he was incarcerated. In the hopes that he would make a mistake, they agreed. He refused to undergo a lie detector exam, but he didn't. Before his 1995 release, James served 13 years as a model prisoner. Leanne was still waiting for him. Good old Leanne. James has been residing in the Boston region ever since. He claims that an inadequate investigation used him as a scapegoat and that he was a political prisoner. According to James, the true Tylenol killer has escaped punishment while he sat in jail and is still a prime suspect. James Lewis was taken into custody in 2004 after assaulting and abducting a lady in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The victim chose not to testify, therefore the case was dismissed on the eve of the court proceedings, even though she had been detained for 3 years awaiting trial. James Lewis's home was investigated by the FBI in 2009 as part of what they described as an ongoing investigation, citing the potential for fresh evidence and technical advancements that could ultimately aid in the crime's resolution. I'm going to assume that they were talking about touch DNA testing, which was created at that time. Only a small number of human skin cells, possibly as little as 6 or 8, can provide a DNA profile using this method. Agents carrying an Apple computer and boxes of paperwork were observed leaving James's house. A storage facility in the Cambridge region was also searched, but no charges were brought as a result. James Lewis and his spouse responded to the FBI's request in 2010 to provide new fingerprints and DNA samples. Unbelievably, James Lewis published his self-published book, which he boldly called Poison, in 2010. To promote his book, he appeared on a Boston public access show for a 45-minute interview. Video snippets of the interview are available online. The entire situation is quite strange. James Lewis claimed that the book was completely made up and took place in a rural region that was comparable to his childhood home. The plot centers on a well that is purposefully tainted with mercury, killing residents. He maintained that he had nothing to do with the Tylenol case and that there was no intentional message about it in his art. He added that he would never have written the extortion letter if he had known what it had done to the victims. That is, to divert the attention away from the true murderer and toward himself. In a further bizarre turn of events, the FBI requested that Ted Kaczynski, the convicted and imprisoned so-called Unabomber, provide a DNA sample for analysis in connection with the 1982 Tylenol murders in 2011. Ted Kaczynski was born and raised in the Chicago area. and he periodically visited his parents' house in the Chicago area at the time of the Tylenol case. From 1978 to 1980, he'd attacked 4 times in Chicago. In an attempt to negotiate with the FBI, Ted filed a motion requesting that they halt the impending auction of his possessions, which included goods confiscated from the cabin in Montana where he had resided, in exchange for his providing the sample. He tried to generate money for his victims through the auction. In particular, the 30,000 pages of his writings, according to the Unabomber, would demonstrate that he was not responsible for the Tylenol poisonings. The auction, however, went according to schedule. In 2025 marked the 43rd anniversary of the Tylenol murders. Media reports from that year suggested that James Lewis would ultimately be charged with the 7 murders by a grand jury. That never took place. On whether James Lewis is truly to blame for the murders, even the case's top detectives are divided. The case is today regarded by some as one of the first instances of what many would now refer to as domestic or homegrown terrorism. To instill dread, James Lewis or another individual chose to randomly attack the populace. And here's a quote from one of the men who has been a part of the inquiry from the start. "Bring the country to its knees." Since then, there have been far too many instances of this type of random violence in America and other parts of the world, where the victims are not hand-picked by insane individuals who choose them for their insane motives. The Boston Marathon bombings, the Sandy Hook and other school shootings, and the Fort Hood, Texas and Oklahoma City bombings are examples of indiscriminate deaths of groups of fellow Americans. By definition, terrorism involves a clear motivation or goal that is politically or religiously driven, and it frequently involves a person or group that claims responsibility. For this reason, some experts disagree with the idea that the Tylenol killings were terrorism. The deaths caused by Tylenol in 1982 are now well known. Acetaminophen tablets containing cyanide were used to kill 7 people in 3 days. Who perpetrated this horrible crime, and why, is still a mystery. The FBI declared in the fall of 2013 that it was no longer able to act as the primary investigator in the murders. The case had just gone cold. All of the leads had been used up, and there were just no new hints despite the constant advancements in forensic technology. That implies that they have yet to discover any solid evidence linking Ted Kaczynski, James Lewis, or anybody else. But law enforcement in the Chicago region haven't given up yet. To keep looking for the person who killed Tylenol, several agencies have formed their own task groups. 7 innocent lives were lost, a nation left in fear, and a case that remains one of the most chilling mysteries in criminal history. Decades have passed, and despite countless investigations, theories, and even suspects, the true identity of the Tylenol killer is still unknown. Was it a lone wolf seeking chaos, a calculated act of terrorism, or a crime that was never meant to be solved? Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, then check out these videos on the screen now. If you have a topic suggestion, please send it to the email in the description. And as always, remember to like, comment, share the video, and subscribe to our channel. And remember, the only thing scarier than this story is missing out on our next video.